Episode 4, The Johnstown Flood. Hey y'all, I'm Heather, and this is Poisoned Appalachia, the dark side of Appalachia. Once again, thanks for listening. Today I want to talk about the Johnstown Flood, one of the worst disasters ever in this country. Johnstown, Pennsylvania was settled in 1791 by Joseph Johns, born Joseph Shantz. The settlement was initially known as Shantstadt, but was soon anglicized to Johnstown. The area was originally the site of a Shawnee and Delaware Indian village called Conemaugh before it was renamed Johnstown. Johnstown was a town of immigrants. The first ethnic church in Johnstown was founded by German immigrants by about 1810. By the 1830s, Johnstown had developed into a small town, and the dominant ethnic group was German. Driven by economic hardship, large numbers of immigrants began to arrive by the 1870s and found work in the growing steel industry and the coal mines that fueled it. The Welsh found work in the coal mines. Most Irish immigrants had originally come to the area to build railroads, and then when that job was completed, they found work in the steel mills. More Germans began to arrive, and by 1880, contract agencies in New York were sending train cars to Johnstown filled with Germans and Scandinavians. Johnstown first became important as the western terminus of the Allegheny Railroad. A series of inclined planes of Pennsylvania Canal barges were transported piggyback on railway cars for 36 miles over the Allegheny Mountains. The Cambria Iron Company started up in 1852. It was one of the largest iron producers of the Civil War. After the Civil War, it was one of the first facilities to use the process of making Bessemer steel, which is lighter than iron. And in 1861, use of the Kelly converter for converting iron to steel spurred the growth of Johnstown's steel industry, which developed the nation's first blooming mill used to reduce the size of steel ingots and produced the first American-made steel rails. By 1873, Johnstown had become a leading American steelmaking center. As the Cambria Iron Works became more successful and more mechanized in the 1870s and 1880s, its need for unskilled laborers grew exponentially. At the same time, the great wave of immigration from southern Eastern European countries, predominantly Italy, Poland, Russia, Bohemia, Hungary, and Slovakia, had begun, and many immigrants settled in Johnstown. Johnstown was technically a company town like the coal towns, but the workers were treated much better. The city invested in infrastructure, and the town was a thriving steel town with homes, churches, saloons, a library, a railway station, electric lights, a roller rink, a hospital, and as the Cambria had over 7,000 workers, the town was thriving. Johnstown was seated at the Little Conemaugh River and Stony Creek River, where they converged to become the Big Conemaugh River. This helped to transport everything to Pittsburgh, 70 miles to the west, and the Pennsylvania Railroad went from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh through Johnstown, and that opened them up to every major city. Steel was used in everything. It was the backbone of the Industrial Revolution. Up until I read about Johnstown, I honestly didn't realize how good of a town it was. I always thought it was more like a coal town, kind of dilapidated, but it wasn't. The people who lived there weren't rich, but they weren't poor either. This was the Gilded Age, though, and the rich were really rich. The late 19th century economic expansion of the time of materialistic excess marked by widespread political corruption. During the Gilded Age, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania was home to many millionaires. Names such as Carnegie, Mellon, Frick, Westinghouse, and Heinz were among the leading citizens of the day. But Pittsburgh was a dirty steel town, and at the time, due to the foul conditions that plagued Pittsburgh for over a century, it was once known as the Smoky City, or Hell with the Lid Off. The upper class, the millionaires of Pittsburgh, needed a break from the pollution. Henry Clay Frick led a group of Pittsburgh speculators, including Benjamin Ruff, to build the South Fork Fish and Hunting Club, 14 miles above Johnstown. It was a treat for the upper class, including Henry Clay Frick and Andrew Mellon. In the middle of the club was Lake Conemaugh, a man-made lake. High above the city, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania built the South Fork Dam between 1838 and 1853 as part of the cross-state canal system, the main line of the public works. Johnstown was the eastern terminus of the Western Division Canal, supplied with water by Lake Conemaugh, the reservoir behind the dam. As railroads superseded canal barge transportation, the Commonwealth abandoned the canal and sold it to the Pennsylvania Railroad. The dam and lake were part of the purchase, and the railroad sold down to private interests. The dam was 72 feet high and 930 feet long. Between 1881, when the South Fork Hunting and Fishing Club was open, and 1889, the dam frequently sprung leaks. It was patched mostly with mud and straw. Additionally, a previous owner had removed and sold for scrap the 5 cast iron discharge pipes that previously allowed a controlled release of water. There had been some speculation as to the dam's integrity, and concerns had been raised by the head of the Cambria Ironworks downstream in Johnstown. At the time, there was no regulations over dams. They just let the owners take care of it. Bad idea. Before the flood, speculators had bought the abandoned reservoir, made less than well-engineered repairs to the old dam, and raised the lake level. They built cottages, a clubhouse, and created the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. Members of this exclusive and secretive retreat in the mountains are 61 wealthy Pittsburgh steel and coal financiers and industrialists, including Andrew Carnegie, Andrew Mellon, Philander Knox, John George Alexander Leishman, and Henry Clay Frick. Daniel Johnson Morrell of the Cambria Ironworks of Johnstown also became a member, ostensibly to monitor the condition of the dam. Major eye roll there. They also lowered the dam to flatten it out so they could travel across it. It was lowered 3 feet at that time. They had stocked the lake with fish who kept getting out and down the spillway, so they created a grate to block the fish from escaping. Unfortunately, this captured all the debris from the lake so it couldn't escape. The dam was sturdy, but like most earthen dams, if the water ever went over it, it would break down and quickly and could collapse. So they took a fairly sturdy dam, lowered it and made it structurally unsafe, and then blocked the spillway so no water could get out of it. They should have known that it was a disaster in the making, and maybe they did, but obviously they didn't care. But they lived in luxury up at the club. By 1889, 16 cottages had been built along the lake, as well as boathouses and stables. The cottages were set out in orderly line among the trees, not very far apart, and only a short way back from the water. They looked far too substantial, really, to be called cottages. Nearly every one of them was 3 stories tall, with high ceilings, long windows, and a deep porch downstairs. Not even the largest of them was dwarfed by the clubhouse. It had enough windows and more than enough porch for 10 houses. There were 47 rooms inside. The club fleet included 50 rowboats and canoes, sailboats, and 2 little steam yachts. So as you can see, they had plenty of money to build the best resort around, but they didn't even take time to think about the safety of others. Honestly, not much has changed with the rich and wealthy all this time. So this is a disaster in the making. One day it started raining and it didn't quit, Forrest Gump once said. I'm sure the people of Johnstown could commiserate. A low-pressure system came up from the Gulf of Mexico. The rainstorm began that May 30th and was the worst in the recorded history of Johnstown. 6 to 10 inches fell in a 24-hour period. It started flooding in the lower part of town, which was common. Deforestation added to the flooding at the time and narrowing of the rivers with dirt and from building the structures. So they were used to that. Up on the mountain, the lake began to fill with water. There are reports that it was rising as much as an inch an hour from all the rain. Elias Unger, who was in charge of the dam, realized that he had a pretty big problem. The lake was only a couple inches from the dam and at that point. They then tried to warn the people of Johnstown by telegraph, but the town, having heard many times before that the lake would overflow, mainly ignored it. At 3 p.m., the dam overflowed, and at 3:15, it gave way. The lake was 2 miles long, a mile wide, and 70 feet deep at that time, and held over 20 million tons of water. It took 40 minutes for the lake to empty, and at the time, the force was as strong as Niagara Falls. Once it started, nothing could stop it. The flood ran down South Fork Creek to the Conemaugh River. The telegraph reporter there, Emma Ernfield, said it looked like a mountain headed towards the town. It destroyed everything in its path, picking up the debris and carrying it with it. The force of the flood crushed everything when the flood hit the town of East Conemaugh. It wiped out the Pennsylvania Railroad depot and killed passengers on all of the trains. The trains were carried off by the flood, houses were ripped off their foundations, and in the next town of Gautier, there was a huge barbed wire factory, and it destroyed it, taking thousands of barbed wire in its wake. Thousands of feet of barbed wire in its wake. So when I was a kid, I thought it was called barbed wire, and I occasionally have caught myself just saying that. But anyways, this wall of water and debris and barbed wire all came barreling down on Johnstown at 30 miles per hour. They said it was like a tsunami with the top of the wave continually crashing down. Because of this, some of the victims were crushed to death rather than drowning. Not a good way to go either way, I would say. It took an hour for the flood to hit Johnstown. It hit the city with a speed of 30 to 40 miles per hour. It slammed into Johnstown, wiping out anything it hit. One survivor stated that it felt like the winds of a hurricane preceding the water. The flood was so powerful that it ripped the clothes right off of many of its victims and put them at risk for hypothermia. It followed the path of the Conemaugh River until it hit a railroad bridge that crossed the river. Surprisingly, the bridge remained standing and didn't collapse, but now all of this debris piled up against it, creating a watertight, dam. This caused the river to backflow up the Stony Creek, hitting the town of Kernville, and the rest of it went back up the Conemaugh, hitting Johnstown again, and it would wash back down and hit it again and again. It created a whirlpool that destroyed all that was left of Johnstown within 10 minutes. Finally, part of the dam created at the railroad bridge gave way, and the water drained out. As if things weren't bad enough, the rest of the debris at the railroad bridge caught on fire. Unfortunately, some people had survived the flood, but now they were trapped there, and 80 people were burned alive. An eerie orange glow covered the landscape. The bridge is still standing and is still in use to this day. The next day, the water receded, and the destruction became more clear. Survivors started coming out of where they had been when the flood hit. Because everything was destroyed, the survivors were left without food, medicine, or clothing. Nearly 500 of those survivors died from typhoid and contaminated water in the aftermath. The final death toll of the flood and the aftermath was over 2,200 people. Looters started searching the dead for money and valuables, which created other survivors to enforce the vigilante justice. And finally, martial law had to be incorporated. The cost of the damage of the flood was over $1,700 million, which would be like about $500,000 today $500,000 in today's money. When news of the flood came out over the news, help started coming in. A lot of private citizens were helping, as well as the National Guard. The railroad repaired the tracks as fast as they could, and relief began coming in on the railways. The railways brought the Red Cross, headed by Clara Barton. Clara Barton was famous for her efforts during the Civil War and was called the Angel of the Battlefield. She started the American chapter of the Red Cross in 1881, and this was the first major disaster they helped with. The Red Cross organized a 3-story hospital, and they built warehouses and survivor accommodations. Clara Barton stayed there for 5 months helping. Crews worked for months cleaning up debris. Some of the worst was at the railroad bridge. All of the barbed wire held the wreckage together, and it was almost impossible to clean up. They eventually had to use dynamite to get it cleared out. Over 2,200 people were killed, and as late as 1911, they were still discovering dead bodies, or at least skeletons. And bodies showed up as far as Cincinnati, Ohio, over 350 miles to the west. Most of the bodies couldn't be identified, so they were all buried in Grandview Cemetery, a cemetery up on the hill with unmarked graves. So were the millionaires who ran the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club forced to pay millions in damages? Were they fined for negligence? Were they charged for homicide or murder? What do you think? That's right. They're rich so they can buy their way out of anything. No one was found guilty of anything because they could not conclude that they were deliberately negligent. Several lawsuits were brought forth over the years, and they were all dismissed. I guess when you're wealthy, you can get away with murder. And, of course, they shut the club down quickly and left the area. When the dam broke on May 31st, 1889, about half a dozen members were on the premises. As it was early in the summer season, there wasn't that many there. They left immediately following the disaster, and the club members were largely silent about this tragedy. A small crowd of angry flood survivors went to the club and broke into one of the buildings, breaking windows and destroying furniture, but no major damage was done. The Johnstown flood resulted in the first expression of outrage at the power of the great trusts and giant corporations that had formed in the post-Civil War period. The public were rightfully outraged. In the first edition following the disaster, the Johnstown paper, The Tribune's editor, George Swank, placed the blame for the disaster clearly on the club. "We think we know what struck us, and it was not the work of Providence. Our misery is the work of man." A New York Times headline read, "An engineering crime, the dam of inferior construction, according to the experts." And a New York World headline on June 7th declared, "The club is guilty." However, most news articles did not mention club members by name. I will say I did read this in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy. The club contributed 1,000 blankets to the relief effort. A few of the club members, mostly Robert Pitcairn, served on relief committees. About half of the club members also contributed to the disaster relief effort, including Andrew Carnegie, whose company contributed $10,000. Later, he would rebuild Johnstown's library. That library building today houses the Johnstown Flood Museum. However, no club member ever expressed a sense of personal responsibilities for the disaster. So I guess there's that. Some of the aftermath of the events surrounding the Johnstown flood did help our justice system come up with new legal standards called strict liability, which means if a dam failed, that the owners would be held financially responsible for the damage the flood caused, whether or not it was due to negligence. Eventually, the town was fully rebuilt. Within a year, the Cambria Ironworks was back up and running. Floods have continued to be a concern for Johnstown, which had major flooding in 1894, 1907, 1924, 1936, and 1977. The biggest flood of the first half of the 20th century was the St. Patrick's Day flood of March 1936. That flood also reached Pittsburgh, where it was known as the Pittsburgh Flood of 1936. Following the 1936 flood, the United States Army Corps of Engineers dredged the Conemaugh River within the city and built concrete river walls, creating a channel nearly 20 feet. Upon completion, the Corps proclaimed Johnstown flood-free. But just like the Titanic was an unsinkable ship, unfortunately Johnstown was not flood-free. On the night of July 19, 1977, a severe thunderstorm dropped 11 inches of rain in 8 hours on the watershed above the city, and the rivers began to rise. By dawn, the city was underwater that reached as high as 8 feet. 7 counties were declared a disaster area, suffering $200 million in property damage, and 78 people died. But Johnstown just keeps picking itself up and brushing itself off again. In 1990, the last steel manufacturing plant shuttered its doors. The high-tech defense industry is now the main non-healthcare staple of the Johnstown economy, with the region pulling in well over $100 million annually in federal government contracts, punctuated by one of the premier defense trade shows in the U.S., the Annual Showcase for Commerce. Johnstown remains a regional medical, educational, cultural, and communications center. As many other locales, healthcare provides a significant percentage of the employment opportunities in the city. Significant efforts have been made to deal with deteriorating housing, brownfields, drug problems, and other issues as population leaves the city limits and concentrates in the suburban boroughs and townships. The Johnstown Fire Department has become a leader in developing intercommunication systems among first responders, and is now a national model for ways to avoid the communication problems which faced many first responders during the September 11th attacks in 2001. And as of the 2020 census, there were 18,411 people, 8,574 households, and 4,399 families residing in the city. Johnstown just keeps Johnstowning on. By the way, Frank Shorno, the last known survivor of the 1889 flood, died March 20th, 1997 at the age of 108, which I find to be amazing. If you'd like to visit Johnstown, there are lots of things to do. You can visit the Johnstown Flood Museum. Also, you can visit the South Fork Club, where the South Fork Club was, and see what's left of the dam. It's a national park now. The Johnstown Inclined Plane, which will take you up the hill and show you a great view of the Johnstown. While up there, visit the Grandview Cemetery, where the graves of the victims are. So there's a lot to do there if you're in the area and go to visit. And that's my episode on the Johnstown flood. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I don't go too much into the history of these things, but I love history, so it's kind of what I do. If you have any comments or questions, you can always contact me on my email, which is poisonappalachia@gmail.com. You can catch me on Facebook. I'm on Instagram, TikTok, Threads, all of that at Poison. I always forget this. Poison_Appalachia. So contact me on any of those too. Email would probably be the best though, or Facebook, because I check those the most. And I hope everything I'm doing so far is good. Hopefully nobody has any problems. If you do, like I said, let me know. I'll see you guys next week. Have a good week. Bye.